These two men were preparing for a desert trip, but their car unexpectedly stalled midway and couldn't start. They had to park the car by the roadside and went down to investigate. Surprisingly, they stared at the machinery for a while, but didn't know how to fix it. At first, they joked and weren't overly concerned. However, anxiety grew when one of them, the handsome young man, took out his phone and realized there was no signal. He hurriedly asked his friend, Fatty, to check their location on the map. After looking into it, they found the nearest residential area was at least 100 kilometers away. This distressed the young man because he felt the temperature was at least 40 degrees Celsius, and the remote road was unlikely to be frequented. The young man became anxious, and decided to climb a hill to check for a signal. Fatty reluctantly followed, given his brother's current reliance on crutches. Despite their situation, Fatty maintained a light-hearted attitude along the way. Soon, they arrived at a hilltop, but their efforts to find a signal were in vain. Sitting on the ground, feeling helpless, the young man suddenly noticed a car approaching in the distance. He rushed to intercept it but slipped and tumbled down the slope. Luckily, the slope wasn't steep, and he was unharmed. He quickly got up and continued to the road, finally stopping the car as it passed. He sought help from the elderly driver and secured a ride to a nearby town. However, when the young man was about to load their luggage, Fatty stopped him. Surprisingly, Fatty told the elderly driver they didn't need help, revealing that he intentionally disconnected a wire in the car. Confused, the young man couldn't fathom why his brother did this. Once Fatty successfully reconnected the car's wiring and started it, the young man finally believed him. After thanking the elderly driver, they let him go. As the elderly driver left, the young man confronted Fatty in anger, demanding an explanation for his actions. Fatty explained that he just wanted an opportunity to sit down and have a meaningful conversation with his brother, as they hadn't talked much since the young man got married. This revelation infuriated the young man, as he was juggling a busy life to provide for his family, and he felt Fatty wasn't prioritizing their bond. The young man reminded Fatty of his responsibilities as a husband and father. Despite their argument, Fatty offered to drive the young man back home. However, when Fatty attempted to start the car, it failed again. Assuming it was due to the disconnected wire, he opened the car hood to inspect. But when he fixed the wiring and attempted to start the car again, the engine emitted white smoke. The young man was devastated at this sight. He threw away his crutches and shouted in frustration. He then sat quietly by the side of the road, unwilling to talk to Fatty. This awkward silence marked a rare moment of tension between the brothers who had been close for decades. One was inside the car, the other on the roadside, both remaining silent and waiting for another passing car. Unfortunately, as night fell, they hadn't seen a single car. With the cold weather intensifying, the young man struggled to endure. He had to gather his belongings and return to the car. Seeing his brother shivering and hungry, Fatty handed him half a drink he was hesitant to consume. After sharing the drink, their relationship began to improve. After all, they were brothers of many years. Unable to sleep due to the cold, they started discussing their dreams from their youth. The young man had always wanted to become a guitarist. However, his parents' plan for him was to graduate from college, get married, have children, and find a stable job to spend his life. He confessed to Fatty that even his hairstyle depended on his parents' approval. Hearing this, Fatty felt sorrow for him. He took out a pair of scissors, deciding to let the young man be his true self for once. After an agreement, they got out of the car and started cutting hair. In a short while, they achieved the stylish haircut the young man had always dreamed of. Looking at himself in the mirror, he appeared somewhat unfamiliar but couldn't help but burst into laughter. Even though they were stranded in the desert, at least here he felt free. After their endeavor, they were exhausted and returned to the car to sleep. The next morning, a car finally passed by. The elderly driver stopped and saw the two men sleeping in the wilderness, which surprised him. Just as Fatty woke up and approached the car for help, the elderly man grew concerned, especially after catching sight of the young man's peculiar haircut in the rearview mirror. Startled, the elderly driver sped away in fear. Watching the hard-won opportunity disappear into the distance, Fatty was furious. He blamed the young man for recklessly approaching the elderly man's car. Despite the young man's attempts to explain, Fatty was unresponsive. He picked up his backpack, ready to leave. The young man wanted to explain, but Fatty wouldn't listen. In frustration, the young man threw a stone at Fatty, unintentionally hitting him on the back of his head. Fatty stood up and touched the area, noticing blood. Enraged, he charged at the young man, and they began to fight. Amid the scuffle, Fatty suddenly bit the young man's thigh. The pain prompted the young man to strike back with his crutch, knocking Fatty down. After the altercation, the young man sat on the ground to catch his breath. However, he waited for quite a while, but there was no sign of Fatty moving. The young man immediately got up to check what was going on. To his surprise, despite shouting for quite some time, Fatty didn't respond at all. This terrified him. What was initially just a playful scuffle between brothers had escalated unexpectedly. The young man sat down on the ground in despair, unsure of what to do. In this desolate desert, He couldn't think of any solutions. The young man could only sit beside his brother, sharing his embarrassing stories. He even found himself laughing alone in hopes of jolting Fatty awake. Unfortunately, after a lengthy attempt, he realized it had no effect. He could only conclude that his brother might truly have passed away. After grieving, the young man began digging a hole in the ground. He didn't want his brother to be left without a proper resting place. Before long, he had dug a sizable hole. He then dragged Fatty over to bury him, but as he was doing so, Fatty suddenly began coughing. This excited the young man greatly. He was relieved that he hadn't accidentally buried his brother alive. Afterward, he let Fatty rest and recover while he kept watch for passing cars. Fatty mentioned that he had lain there for a whole day and wanted to sit up. However, as soon as he got up, he noticed the dug-up earth on the ground. He mistakenly thought that the young man was planning to bury him alive for arguing with him. In fear, Fatty struggled to distance himself and picked up a small knife from the ground, keeping the young man at bay. Despite the young man's repeated explanations, Fatty refused to believe him. Carrying his backpack, Fatty decided to sever their brotherly relationship completely. After declaring his decision, he turned and left alone. Left on his own, the young man sat there in confusion. Without his companion, he found himself waking up from sleep in fear during the night. He even began sensing something around him. After making sure no one was around, he quickly returned to the car and turned on the headlights to boost his courage. However, just as he turned them on, he saw a wild wolf. He immediately honked the horn, scaring the wolf away. Later, he tried to sleep in the car, but the cold wind outside intensified. Shivering, he had no choice but to get out of the car and crawl into the large hole he had dug earlier, covering himself with soil for warmth. As he was about to fall asleep, Fatty suddenly appeared, holding a small knife. Fatty had returned due to the extreme cold. Seeing Fatty holding the knife to his own throat, the young man didn't resist but told Fatty to go ahead if he didn't believe him. After contemplating, Fatty couldn't bring himself to go through with it. After all, decades of friendship weren't so easily shattered. Facing the harsh weather, the two brothers huddled together in the hole to keep warm. On the following day, a patrolling officer drove by. He stopped but only saw an abandoned car. Assuming that tourists had left it there while exploring nearby, he drove away. In the hole, the young man heard the noise and attempted to shout, but after 3 days without water, his throat was too parched to make a sound. With the daytime temperature rising, the two had to come out of the hole. To survive, they had to draw water from the car's radiator. Though unpleasant to drink, it sustained them. They leaned against the car, waiting for a whole day, but no cars passed by. That night, Fatty lay back in the hole to sleep, while the young man took out a photo of his child and cried. This seemed to be his strongest motivation for survival. Thinking ahead, the young man checked the map. Instead of waiting helplessly, he thought it would be better to take initiative and seek assistance. After some searching, he found a nearby town on the map. This discovery filled him with determination. He hurried to wake Fatty from his slumber, informing him about the possible presence of a settlement on the map. However, Fatty was trembling from the cold and told the young man that he had lost too much blood and could hardly move. He urged the young man to leave him behind and go on his own. However, how could the young man abandon his brother in such a dire situation? Despite his leg injury, he insisted on helping Fatty up, even using his crutch if necessary. They might have their differences, but they were still brothers. Little did they know that as soon as they climbed the hill, the young man heard a sound from behind. He turned around and was astonished to see a car coming in the direction of their vehicle. Excitedly, he shouted and yelled, but unfortunately, the distance was too far for the passersby to hear. Just as the young man was about to run back for help, he suddenly witnessed a person hooking up their car and towing it away. It seemed they had encountered despicable car thieves. The hope they had nurtured so hard was shattered in an instant. Both of them felt almost on the brink of collapse and despair. However, for the sake of survival, they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Even the powerful storm couldn't deter their instinct to survive. After an uncertain amount of time, they saw utility poles ahead, indicating that there must be a dwelling nearby. Following the poles, they finally found an abandoned shack not far away. Upon inspection, they discovered a well. Immediately, they lay under the water tap, savoring the cool spring water. Then, the young man found an iron bucket inside the house. Filling it to the brim, they prepared to continue their journey. However, just a few steps later, they heard a cell phone ringing. The young man took it out, and was surprised to find a signal here. Excitedly, they answered the call and spoke with relief. After enduring countless hardships, they finally received help. The two brothers, hoping to return to a normal life, faced with adversity, were determined to lead a better life.